Good afternoon and welcome to the October Crop Production and WASDE briefings. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Ag Statistics Board here at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're very pleased to have Deputy Secretary Xochitl Torres Small, USDA's Deputy Secretary, joining us as Secretary Designate today. We also welcome Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist. Madam Deputy Secretary, Dr. Meyer, I'd like to share that we have representatives from the OECD and Virginia Tech joining us today, as well as staff from ERS, the Office of Ethics, the Office of the Chief Economist, and the Office of Budget and Planning. It's great to have guests with us here in the room and on our live stream today. I also want to express our appreciation to John Stevens of our Sacramento office, right back there, and Jenna Bates of our Austin office, as well as the entire Florida Citrus team. Thanks to each of them for their valuable assistance. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The crop production and WASDE reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of the reports within 1 hour of their release. We will not be taking questions during the briefing from the public. However, NASS and World Board staff are available for email or phone questions, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what's presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch. Lance will be immediately followed by Dr. Mark Jekanowski, Chair of the World Ag Outlook Board. Lance? Esteemed, yes, that's right. The esteemed Lance Honig.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to everybody online as well. Make sure we got this rolling, and we do. As usual, I've got a lot of information to share, and so I'll move fairly quickly, but we'll certainly have an opportunity for questions at the end. So we'll certainly take care of that then. Before we get into anything too specific, anytime you see a gray box at the beginning of my presentation, it mimics what we have on the front of the report, and it just draws folks' attention to anything that we think they might want to make sure they know before they dig too deeply into the data. And for this month, what that means is just a quick reminder that this is the month, time period when we have an opportunity to revise our planted and harvested acreage, specifically for this month: canola, dry edible beans, and sunflower. And of course, we're looking at all the available data we have, but the big driver behind it is really the certified acreage information from FSA. And so this is what we have done as usual. And as we get toward these crops a little bit later on in the presentation, you'll see what the impact of that review was. I always like to start things off by talking a little bit about the information that went into the numbers inside the report. It's a combination of survey data as well as other administrative sources. From a survey perspective, in particular, our farmer reported survey, our ag yield survey, as we call it. We surveyed nearly 8,000 producers this month. You can see between September 29th and October 5th. Essentially, we were asking them to report what they either expect their yields to be, or as we get to this time of year, oftentimes they're reporting on actual harvest results. And so that's what we did again this month for the crops, field crops included in the reports today. In addition to that, we have some field surveys that we did. First off, our objective yield survey, that was for corn, cotton, and soybeans. Rather than surveying farmers, this is where we actually send trained enumerators into fields, where we lay out plots. They take counts, measurements, ultimately we'll harvest portions of those plots, which is pretty prevalent this time of year, the harvest part. And so we send those items that we harvest off to our lab in St. Louis, analyzed for yield there. In addition to that, you'll see several pieces of information that we do out in the field, specifically in Florida for our citrus forecast. And so it's a combination this time of year of establishing acreage, or maybe put another way, tree counts. And then we've got some other work that we do to establish fruit set per tree, and then ultimately measuring size and drop as well. Those are all critical components to determining orange crop size in particular in Florida, as well as some of the other citrus crops. And you'll hear the results of that as we get further in as well. And then just a couple of other sources of data that we use. We do have some satellite information that we model some yield information specifically for corn and soybeans, mainly in the Corn Belt. And so we incorporated that this month. And then I already mentioned the FSA certified acres. Obviously a key component in the acreage review that we did this month for those crops I mentioned. Just very quickly, a snapshot here of what those ag yield sample sizes look like by state. Of course, the deeper the color, the larger the sample. So you can kind of see where we concentrate most heavily those samples, the producers that we reached out to for the report. Moving ahead, we'll jump into corn first. Before we talk about the actual forecast, just give you a quick update on harvest progress. What you can see on this graphic is some information from our weekly crop progress and condition report. What you see here is the percent of the corn that was harvested by week for not only this year, which is the red line you see, but the previous 5 seasons as well. As of October 1st, 23% of the corn was harvested nationwide. That compares with 19% last year, 21% on average, just a little bit ahead of average, as you can kind of see on the graphic, but certainly pretty much in line with what we've seen most of the recent years. With that said, we will take a look at the corn forecast. No change this month to planted or harvested acreage. That is the normal practice for this time of year, but as a quick reminder, you can see acreage up fairly sharply this year compared with last. Yield, though, we're now forecasting 173 bushels per acre. That's down just 0.5% or 0.8 of a bushel from what we forecast last month. So we're now actually looking at a yield that's 0.2% or 0.4 of a bushel below last year's final yield. That puts our new production forecast at 15.1 billion bushels. That's 0.5% below last month, but still nearly 10% more than was produced last season. This next graphic just highlights the corn yield over the last 30 seasons. And you can see that gray line representing the trend line in there. That 173 bushel per acre forecast is below trend, but still the 6th highest yield on record. This next map I have for you highlights the corn yield forecast by state and how they compare with last month's forecast. The way this map is laid out, the top number is the current yield forecast for each state. The lower number represents the percent change from last month's yield forecast. Any state colored in any shade of blue is increasing from last month. Any shade of red is decreasing. The deeper the tone, the larger the change. You don't see much difference in tone on this map, but as we move further through the presentation, you'll see how that impacts how the map looks. And that's really the point here, is that we are looking at pretty much just minor changes across the country, not only nationally, but on a state by state basis. Anytime you see a pound sign next to a number indicates that that's a record high yield. And we are looking at record high corn yields this year in Alabama, Indiana, Ohio, and South Carolina. This next map again highlights the corn yields by state, but here you can see a comparison to last season's final yields. And so here you will see some deeper colors because we do see some larger changes, both increases and decreases year over year, depending on which part of the country you're in. Obviously heavily weather driven. And again, you can see where those records are on the map here as well. This next graphic just provides some information from the satellite work that we do. Again, showing some of the modeled yields based on that satellite information. Essentially, it's NDVI, or normalized difference vegetation index, that we model against. The way this map is laid out, as you can kind of see on the color scale, the deeper you get into those bluish type tones, those are the higher yields. And then as you drift more toward the browner type scale, those are going to be your lower yields. And so it just gives you a kind of a visual of exactly how those yields have been varying across the key growing area this season. Next, we have some information from our corn objective yield survey. What you see on this graphic is that vertical bar represents the percent of those objective yield samples that were processed in the lab. So remember, I talked about as mature, they get mature enough, we can harvest portions, send them to the lab. You can see between the mature and dense stage, those both get harvested and sent off. About 86% of our samples we were able to send to the lab for analysis, pretty much in line with what we would normally expect for this month. Some additional information from the Corn Objective Yield Survey. What you see on this graphic is each of those vertical bars represents the number of ears per acre as measured from the Objective Yield Survey. The red dots represent effectively that published 10-state region yield because we do objective yield for corn in the 10 states. And so it shows you a little bit of the relationship between that ear population and how that's translating into yield this year. Not much movement from month to month on that, which we wouldn't expect typically this time of year. This next chart really just gives you a quick look at how the current corn production forecast at just over 15 billion bushels compares over the recent seasons. Again, up from last year, and this now represents the third highest corn production total on record, barely behind the previous or the other two higher years. Next, we'll take a quick look at how the corn production forecast today compares with the published industry expectations. The way this graphic is laid out, each of those blue dots represents an individual industry member's published expectation of what the corn production forecast would be. The red block represents that NASS forecast, and you can see the red block right in the middle of the blue dots. So shouldn't be much of a surprise with that number today. Next, we'll shift over to soybeans. Again, a quick update on harvest progress for the soybeans. As of October 1st, 23% of that crop was harvested, pretty much in line with what we saw both last year and average. Much like corn, no change to the planted and harvested acreage this month compared with last. Unlike corn, though, we are looking at smaller acreage this year than we did last year. Current yield forecast 49.6 bushels per acre. That is down 1%. Or just half a bushel from last month's forecast, and we're now actually equal to last year's final yield, putting our new production forecast at 4.10 billion bushels, 1% below last month and nearly 4% below what was produced last year. Taking a quick look at the yields over the last 30 seasons for soybeans, much like corn, you can see second consecutive year below trend, but again, still the fifth highest yield on record. Much like I showed you for corn, here you can see those soybean yields by state and how they compare first with last month. So this is the comparison back to last month's forecast. Mostly you see small changes across most of the growing area, a little bit of an exception, particularly in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Obviously conditions less than ideal in that part of the country, and we're seeing that reflected here. Much like corn, some pound signs to point out. These are the record high yields this year for soybeans. That's Arkansas, Indiana, Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee. And again, just a quick comparison here to last year's final yields. Again, just showing you a comparison on a year-over-year basis by state. Much like you saw for corn, here you can get a look at how those yields are varying across the major growing area for soybeans based on the modeled yields from the satellite information that we had. Obviously, you can see much lower yields in portions of North Dakota up there, but relatively speaking, those are still pretty good yields from North Dakota this year as well. Looking again at some information from the Objective Yield Survey here for soybeans, you can see 51% of the samples were processed in the lab, a little bit below maybe the average, but as you can see, many years either at or below that level as well. So overall, I describe it as pretty normal level for us this month. Looking at the other information from the soybean objective yield, again, here you can see in this case, the pods per 18 square feet. Represented by the vertical bars there. You do see a little bit of an increase from last month, but as you look back to earlier years, you can see we typically will see a little bump from September to October, so nothing too out of the ordinary there this year either. Next, looking at the soybean production compared with the recent seasons, here we're looking at the seventh highest production on record. And then last but not least for the soybeans, we'll wrap it up by talking about how today's production forecast compares with the published industry expectations down toward the bottom end. In fact, right at the bottom end of those published expectations. So maybe just a little bit of a surprise on the soybean number there today. Moving on to cotton, harvest progress there as of the first 18% complete. Again, very much in line with what we've seen in the recent seasons. Moving on to our acreage yield and production numbers for cotton. Again, no change from last month on our planted or harvested acres. The big story on the acreage this year for cotton, of course, is a big drop in the planted area. But we're still looking at a higher harvested area this year because of the extreme abandonment last year. So we're actually bouncing back to a much more normal harvested to planted ratio this season, due primarily to Texas. That's where the big drop was last year. They're at a much more normal level this season. Overall, though, you can see we're now forecasting yield at 767 pounds per acre. That is down just 2.4% from last month, more than 19% below last season. And so that puts our new production forecast at just under 13 million bales, off again 2.4% month over month, 11.4% below last season. As we take a look at the yields and how they compare over recent years, you see the big drop year over year. Of course, last year with the high abandonment, we ended up with a record high yield because we abandoned all the worst acres. And so with the struggles that we see in Texas in particular this year with dry weather, obviously not only coming off a record high yield, but at a fairly low level. In fact, that is the lowest yield nationally since 2015. Next, we'll give you just a quick look at those yields by state and how they compare with last month. Again, as I just mentioned, with some of those poor conditions in Texas, you can see a fairly sharp drop in the yield month over month. Obviously seeing some mixed results across the country beyond that, but of course, Texas is our largest producing state and having the biggest impact on what we see happening nationally. Similarly, as we look at those yields by state and how they compare with last year, again, the big story there with Texas, despite the fact that their harvested acreage is up, yields down considerably year over year due to the dry weather there. And as we look at the cotton production over the recent years, you can see this is the second consecutive year of declining production. As we take a look at the current cotton production forecast and how it compares with expectations, much like corn, appears to be pretty much right in line with what folks were expecting. So I don't think there will be a big surprise there as well. Several other crops included in the report today. We'll run through fairly quickly. Canola, one of the crops I mentioned at the beginning. We reviewed the planted and harvested acreage this month, and as a result, you can see we did increase planted area by 3%, harvested by 2.5% from our previous forecast based on the FSA certified acreage information. Our first yield and production forecast of the season, though, for canola, you can see yield for that crop down 1.2% year over year, putting our production at just over 4 billion pounds. It is up 4.9% year over year because of the increased acreage. In fact, the U.S. planted acreage, harvested acreage, and production are all record high levels. But it's the tale of two crops there, if you will. We're looking at record high production in North Dakota and Washington and record low production in Kansas and Oklahoma. Completely different weather in those two parts of the country. Dry edible beans, another crop that we reviewed acreage for. In this particular case, though, we did bring acres down just over 4% on both planted and harvested area. You can see those acreage numbers both down year over year as well. Yield at 1,962 pounds per acre is up 3.3% from our previous forecast, but still 7% below last year's final yield. So overall, we're looking at a production number down 13.2% year over year. Lowest acres since 2019, but second highest yield since 2019 for the dry beans. Looking at our hay crops first, alfalfa, no change to acres there, but quick reminder, we are up 5% on our harvested area for alfalfa this year, year over year. Yield, we're now forecasting 3.37 tons per acre. That is up 7.7% from the August forecast. So now we're looking at a yield 4.7% above last season. So that'll put our production expectations up 10% year over year as we're finally getting a little bit of traction back after some real struggles with the dry weather across some key growing areas in the last couple of seasons. So good news there. Actually looking at the highest alfalfa yield since 2016. So some good news finally there. Other hay, kind of a similar story there. You can see acreage up about the same amount year over year as we talked about for alfalfa. Yield just a little bit of a bump from what we were expecting back in August, but again, higher than it was last year. So we are expecting other hay production to also be up fairly significantly year over year. And then peanuts, you can see again, no change to the acreage this month, but pretty sharp increase year over year there. Yield off just a little bit from last month's forecast. We're now 2.6% below last year, but because of the increased acreage production there, we're looking at the fourth highest total on record and a 12.7% increase year over year. Looking at our rice crop, big increase in acreage this year as the water situation improved considerably from what we had seen last year. Very minor change to yield this month. You can see down just 0.2%. So we're still up 4.8% and still at a record high yield for rice this season. So production still up very significantly due to the increased acreage compared to last year. Sorghum production, you can see overall huge increase year over year. That's a combination of a big increase in acreage and a big increase in yield. Again, that's a big part of the story is last year's struggles. Texas and Kansas, of course, making up the vast majority of the production. Although conditions have not been wonderful this year, they were pretty horrendous last year. And so we're bouncing back some pretty poor numbers last year. Looking at our sugar crops, you can see for sugar beets first, our acreage is down a bit this year, but our yield is up. So overall, we're expecting production to be 6.6% higher than it was last season. Colorado's looking at their lowest production since 85. Montana's the lowest since 84. Of course, Montana, part of that is the factory closing. So we're looking at smaller production there. Sugar cane, acreage very much in line with what we saw last year. Yields are down a bit year over year. So overall, the production is down there as well. And then sunflower production, you can see that was the last of the three crops I mentioned we reviewed acreage for. Pretty minor changes there, down about 2% on the acres from what we had previously forecast. It's our first yield and production forecast of the season for sunflower. And so you can see overall production down 21.9%, mostly due to reduced acreage this year. The last field crop that I have to talk about is tobacco. You can see slight adjustment on the acreage there from our previous forecast. So we're now expecting record low harvested acres for cotton, but we're also expecting the seventh highest yield on record. So overall, the production only down 4% year over year, despite that record low harvested acres. A few other crops that we'll talk about today. First of all, pecans. You can see this is our first production forecast of the season for pecans. We expect that to be down 10.7% to 248 million pounds this season, and that would be the second lowest production since 2009. So not a great pecan crop out there this season, as I'm sure you're well aware. And then the last group of crops that I'm going to talk about today would be representing our first forecast of the upcoming season for our citrus crops, which is why we've got our Florida team in town this week to help us out with that. So all orange production, you can see good news there. We're looking at a crop 10.1% above what we actually produced last season. The Valencia portion of the crop actually up 3.94 million boxes from what was produced last year. Non-vals up 1.73 million boxes. Kind of breaking that down by state, in particular Florida and California. Florida is expecting increases on both their Valencia and non-Valencia crops this year. They're still small. Generally speaking, we're looking at fewer trees, a lower fruit set. And then, of course, we'll work through the size and drop as the season goes on. But overall, at least they're up year over year. California expecting increases as well. Texas expecting some decreases there, but again, California and Florida, much larger producing states than Texas. So that's what's driving the totals for you there. Grapefruit, you can see we're expecting 309,000 tons this year. That's down 5.5% year over year. Florida's got a very modest increase expected this year, but it'd still be the 5th lowest grapefruit production on record in Florida. California and Texas also expecting lower numbers this season. Lemons, you can see 980,000 tons expected there. That's down 12.2% year over year. Of course, there, excuse me, we're looking at California and Arizona are producing states there. California's driving the decrease. California is actually up slightly year over year. And then last but not least, the tangerines and mandarins. That crop also expected to be down this year. In fact, down 2.8% year over year. California is the big driver on the tangerines. They're expecting a crop about 700,000 boxes below last year. Florida, kind of like we talked about with grapefruit, a modest increase, but the 3rd lowest production on record expected there. So even though we've got some bright spots with bigger numbers than last year, still pretty small crops, particularly in Florida. Just a few other slides before I wrap up. Here you can see some of the upcoming reports over the next month or so. Cattle on feed, cotton ginnings, rice stocks, ag prices still coming up yet this month. On the 1st, of course, our monthly care reports there. And then on November 9th, we'll be back here with some new updates on the crop production as well as cotton ginnings. A couple of quick reminders for everybody before I wrap up. First of all, next week, October 17th and 18th, both afternoons, we will be hosting our fall virtual data users meeting. We'll be entirely virtual, so we encourage folks to get out there and register. We'll have a lot of great information to share and an opportunity for questions to be answered. So that's generally a very good time. And then later this afternoon, not too much later, soon this afternoon, at 1 o'clock, I will be out on X hosting our regular Stat Chat series. And so I will have an opportunity to see what folks think about the numbers that we just talked about here and answer any questions that they might have about anything included in the report today. So that's the last slide I have for you. I'm going to turn things over to Mark, the esteemed chair of the World Ag Outlook Board. There's a story there. We do that before we lose it.
Or else I'm known as the guy who follows the esteemed Lance Honig. All right, well, good afternoon. So I'm going to walk you through the WASDE. Like Lance, I have a lot of information. I'm going to try to move through quick to not keep you too long, but and maybe have some chance for questions at the end. But I'm going to go through all the main commodities, try to hit the highlights. So let's jump right in. First of all, this is October, so this WASDE, we're going to be incorporating all the information we got this morning from the crop production report, as well as the important reports we got late last month: hogs and pigs, grain stocks, small grains, etc. So, so these balance sheets incorporate all of that. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about soybean production in India. And then just a little discussion on our Brazil cotton balance sheet, where we made basically some accounting changes that I wanted to talk through real quick. So let's start in here with wheat production. Globally, wheat production, the wheat production forecast was reduced this month, down 3.9 million tons. Offset to some degree by an increase in the U.S., which we'll talk about in when we get to the U.S. balance sheet. But basically, this is driven by reductions in Australia, where, not too surprising, it's been hot and dry, drought conditions there affecting their yield outlook. Kazakhstan, a little bit of an opposite situation there. It started out dry, but now they've had some pretty severe rains at harvest, affecting their yield outlook. Also not on this list in terms of countries, also driving the global outlook, Ethiopia. We reduced production there 2 million tons to 5.5 million. Big reduction area and yield, reflecting civil unrest, high input costs, and poor weather as well. Also, we reduced Brazil's production 500,000 tons. Global balance sheet for wheat. Main things I'll focus on here. We talked about production, so total supplies tightening up a bit. Feed use down this month, mainly reflecting lower feed use in Russia, given their higher exports out of Russia. So lower, reduced supplies in the country for feed. Also Kazakhstan and the smaller crop there, so lower feed use in Kazakhstan. Trade down, that is reflecting smaller crops in Australia, Kazakhstan, and Brazil. And ending stocks tightening up 500,000 tons. That will be the lowest ending stocks since 2015-16. Global ending stocks, that is. So US wheat balance sheet. No new data today, as you heard from NAS, no new data on the wheat supply outlook, but we did, this incorporates the important September 29 reports, in particular the small grain summary, which showed higher US wheat production, mainly hard red spring, along with a little bit also increase in hard red winter. Incorporating also September 1 stocks into this balance sheet, suggesting a little bit higher disappearance than we had been expecting last month. So that is reflected in that higher feed and residual use. And ending stocks up a bit in the US. Average market price, our season average market price, we reduced by 20 cents per bushel, reflecting both current pace, price outlook and higher stocks expected to weigh on those prices as well. World rice production, not much going on here, not very minimal changes globally in terms of production. Small change in Japan, that's mainly based on an attaché report. One other change, again, not listed in terms of the country, but that, in terms of the countries listed there, but that I'll just mention is that we increased North Korea rice production, mainly reflecting satellite imagery, increased their area, rice area there, and they've also had good weather. So raised them by about 8%. Global rice supply and use, beginning stocks up 600,000 tons this month. That mainly reflects increased imports by Indonesia, where Indonesia has been building stocks in anticipation of a potential shortfall given the El Nino conditions that they're thinking about there. So they're building their stocks up. They're now the third largest global rice importer. So that's where most of those stocks are, in terms of that increase in the beginning stocks for estimate. And then another thing I would just note in terms of the trade, increased our trade forecast there a bit. That's mainly higher exports out of Vietnam and Cambodia. And in case you're curious, we did not make any changes to India this month. US rice balance sheet, incorporating the information we got this morning from NAS in terms of a little bit of a yield reduction for US rice, tightening up production by about 400,000 hundredweight. Also raised our export forecast by 1 million hundredweight. That is all long grain rice and mainly reflecting increased sales to Mexico and Central America for US long grain. And with a slightly smaller production and higher exports, that tightens up ending stocks, as you can see there, by 1.4 million hundredweight. Didn't make any change to our market price forecast this month. So let's move into corn. Again, relatively small changes in terms of the global production outlook. Argentina raised by 1 million tons. That is an area increase, government data. EU corn production up a bit there as well, 300,000 tons. That's France. That's all increase in France. And FSU, see, we didn't change Ukraine or Russia, but that is increased production in Moldova based on official data there. Global balance sheet with those small production changes, relatively small changes in the global corn balance sheet as well. Few things that beginning stocks down. That's mainly lower beginning stocks in the lower stocks in the U.S., which we'll talk about in the next slide, and partially offset by higher stocks in Ukraine based on trade data in the back year. Feed use up a bit as well. That's mainly higher feed use in Argentina and the EU, reflecting larger crops there. And with those tighter beginning stocks, that translates largely into a little bit of a tighter ending stocks as well globally for the new crop. So U.S. balance sheet, I put up the old crop here as well, along with the new crops. This is the crop, of course, that was harvested last year, that season just wrapped up. And this balance sheet is essentially final now, incorporating the ending stocks estimate we got from NASS. So that is, that is now official, that sets the ending stocks. And then, incorporating also updated data for the other use categories for which we have data, like ethanol use and industrial use. Basically the changes are applied to feed and residual. So what you're seeing here in terms of the old balance sheet is essentially the final balance sheet for that old crop year. And it indicates that we are carrying in 90 million bushels fewer into the new crop than we had been anticipating last month. And then with that, we also, of course, incorporate the new production estimates from NASS this month. The production down just about 70 million bushels. So supplies tightened up, I should say, this month by about 160 million bushels. That's going to come out a little bit out of exports. We've seen fairly slow early season demand, export demand for U.S. corn. So that is reflected in this reduction in the corn export forecast by 25 million bushels. And then the balance essentially tightens up ending stocks. And with those tighter stocks, we made a small bump up in our season average price forecast for corn. Moving into soybeans, again, sort of a theme here, not a lot of changes globally. The main change in terms of global supplies this month, it comes from the changes that we'll talk about soon with regard to the U.S. balance sheet. Other than that, the other main change we made this month was to India, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about that. Essentially, they've had a really unusual growing season. So I'll walk you through a few slides to explain that. The other one little thing I wanted to point out here too, in terms of other countries that aren't listed on that on that list, we added Benin to the database this month. They've been increasing production, and they're also exporting some to China. So it's a country that we want to start to monitor a little bit more closely. So, and they account for about 300,000. They're small, but noteworthy. So regarding India, pulled our production forecast back by 1 million tons. And so just a quick review. Here's the main areas of the country where soybeans are produced in India. And essentially what happened here is, early in the season, when the crop went in, conditions actually looked pretty good. They had good moisture, but beginning in August, it became extremely dry. They essentially got almost no rain in August, which then was followed by record precipitation in September. So the crop went in good, then it got too dry, then it got too wet. So kind of an unusual situation there, but and this is what it looks like in terms of a rainfall trace. Again, good early season, then near record dry, then near record wet. So that's affecting their yield outlook. And because of that, we lowered production, essentially lowered yield, but lowered production 8%. And as you can see there, I mean, it's a significant cut, but not record low by any stretch. But still, given that unusual growing condition, we had to make that kind of an adjustment. So global soybean balance sheet. Few things here to note. Again, for this one, I'm putting up last year's, the back year balance sheet, as along with the new global balance sheet. And the thing I wanted to mainly point out here in the back year is the higher crush estimate for the back year. And also it carries through into the front year as well. Basically what we did was we raised China's crush by 1 million tons in the back year, and then also carried that 1 million ton increase into the new year as well. So, and at the same time, higher trade, that mainly, that reflects higher exports out of Brazil. So with the higher crush and higher trade, but the result is tighter ending stocks from last season's crop than we, had been expecting. So we're carrying in, 1.1 million ton fewer soybeans into the current crop year. And again, as I mentioned, crush, that is an increase in China by 1 million tons, offset partially by lower crush in India, reflecting consistent with the lower production we're forecasting there, as well as lower crush in Pakistan, where they're going to import less. Trade changes this month in terms of the global balance sheet, lower US exports and higher partially offset by higher exports out of Brazil. So regarding the US balance sheet, again, like with corn, I put up the back year balance sheet because, again, that balance sheet is essentially final. We have the final NAST stocks estimate and final crush and trade data. So essentially what you see there is where things are going to land for that crop year. And it suggests that we're carrying in a little bit higher beginning stocks than we had been expecting, which is probably a good thing because, as you saw from Lance's presentation today, production this season is down. What was adjusted lower this month, so that partially offsets this month's lower production, but still total supplies tightening up this month compared to last month. Tighter supplies means that's going to come out of basically exports and lower US exports, while we're also seeing higher Brazilian exports. So that's the offset there. Ending stocks end up unchanged for this month. And no change to our season average price forecast either. Let me back up. The other thing I just want to point out, crush, we raised our crush forecast as well by 10 million bushels. And that's important because I want to talk briefly about the soybean oil balance sheet. Again, for the back year, we're almost complete in terms of that back year balance sheet. We need one more month of data, but just want to draw your attention to the big increase adjustment we made to biofuel, soybean use for biofuel this month, up 300 million pounds, soybean oil use for biofuel, just reflecting a lot of these renewable diesel facilities coming online sooner than we might have expected. And that is also extending into the new year as well. With greater biofuel use, that use comes out of food, feed, and other uses and stocks. So we reduced food, feed, and other use by 200 million pounds and ending stocks by 100 million pounds in the old crop year, which means we're carrying in a little bit tighter stocks into the new marketing year. Production up, reflecting that increase in crush that I talked about in the earlier balance sheet. And again, carrying forward the increase in biofuel production up also 300 million pounds in the new marketing year. Taking away some use out of food, feed, and other, and ending stocks again tightening up a bit this month relative to what we had last month, driven again by that increase in soybean oil use for biofuel. All right, now into cotton. In terms of global production, few changes here worth noting. Argentina up 100,000 bales. That's area data based on AgMin. I'm going to jump to Australia. That reflects drought conditions there. So reduced area of dry land cotton in Australia. Dry conditions there. Now Brazil. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, and I'm going to get into a little bit of a discussion of accounting in our balance sheets, but basically that 800,000 bale reduction in Brazil, 200,000 of that is an actual yield reduction from Conabi. 600,000 of that is a result of an accounting change that we made, which again, I don't want to keep you in suspense, but I'm going to do that for at least the next couple of slides because it deserves its own attention. And also worth noting that this accounting change is also what's driving most of the changes on this balance sheet as well. In fact, production changed a little bit, but the changes in beginning and ending stocks is all a result of this change in the way we account for Brazil's production in when we put them in the marketing year, or what marketing year we put them in, I should say. So, all right, so let's cover the U.S. balance sheet real quick. Again, the main thing we're focused on here is the new crop production, cotton production data we got from NASS this morning. So U.S. production down 320,000 bales. We pulled our export forecast down 100,000, reflecting those tighter supplies, and then also tightens up ending stocks by 200,000. So that 300,000 bale reduction is allocated between exports and ending stocks. No change to our season average price forecast. Now, this is the part you've been waiting for. In terms of our changes for Brazil, just a couple things to point out here. First of all, for some context, you have to keep in mind Brazil's production has been growing over time. They have a larger and larger share of global production, and the timing of that production in Brazil, over the past couple of decades, Brazil's production has shifted northward, and the result being that when that crop is available on the market, has shifted into the time that essentially aligns with when Northern Hemisphere, when U.S. crops are available in the market. And the way we had been doing this for years and years, reflecting historic production patterns, is that Brazil's current year production would always show up in last year's balance sheet. And as a result, Brazil's production ended up going directly into last year's ending stocks, giving an artificially high view of what last year's ending stocks were. We shifted their marketing year so that now the crop that is essentially available to the market now is being reflected in the current market, in the current WASDE marketing year. So again, it makes for a fairly big change in terms of this month's changes to global stocks and Brazil, and this is, Brazil's ending stocks, and that also impacts global ending stocks, but it will going forward better represent the actual availability of that cotton on the market. All right, now into sugar. Let me get caught up on my own notes here. So the sugar balance sheet, quite a lot going on this month, as you can see, in terms of the old crop year, 2022. I'm just going to remind you real quick that the sugar marketing year aligns with the fiscal year. So sugar marketing year ends September 30th. So what you're seeing here in terms of the old crop year, reduced cane production for the old crop year. Basically what that means is there was some cane production that we expected to be harvested this past September that would have showed up in the last year's balance sheet that actually has been shifted into the new crop year. So just kind of a temporal shift there on the production side. And then the rest of the data is basically rest of the variables data in this balance sheet is essentially truing up to mainly trade data. You can see we essentially final in terms of our TRQ estimate, although there too, there's a little bit of some timing issues because some of this TRQ, if it's under an FTA, can come in on a calendar year basis. So some of this reduction in TRQ is actually shifted into the new crop year. So minor changes, but worth noting. The main thing to take away from this is that given all of these changes in terms of our nearly final import data and our supply data, ending stocks for the old crop year, fair amount tighter than we had expected, meaning that we're carrying in to the new crop year a little bit tighter market situation than we were thinking just in September. And as you can see, those tighter beginning stocks mainly are mainly reflected in tighter ending stocks as well. We didn't make any change to our Mexico import. We're going to talk about Mexico balance sheet in just a minute. Domestic deliveries, just kind of some changes this marketing year based on the trends that we saw from last marketing year. So fairly small changes on the rest of the balance sheet. Regarding Mexico, also quite a lot going on here. So key point, I think that, the key item to take away from this is that Mexico has been importing a lot of sugar, and they're expected to continue to import a lot of sugar. And consumption within Mexico is also holding up quite well. So they are importing to serve those, the needs of their own market. And that's also been supporting, their availability for exports to the US. Now, this reduction in Mexico exports, Mexico, at this point, Mexico's exports are fully consistent with what we are reporting as US imports from Mexico. Again, to kind of put that balance sheet to rest. Now into the new crop year, 2023, 2024, is again, some important things to point out here. Sugar production in Mexico has been suffering a bit, very low precipitation, drought in many of the main production regions. So their production forecast has been reduced. Domestic use is up. Their consumption is holding up and also accounting for population growth. So domestic use is expected to continue to grow. Ending stocks, Mexico likes to target about 2.5 months of ending stocks on hand, which means that imports and exports tend to be the residual in the Mexico balance sheet. The The reduction in exports here is mainly expected to be to third countries, not to the US. And we expect Mexico to continue to import large amounts of sugar to serve their own needs. Okay, that's crops. So let's move into meat and livestock. Beef production for 2023 this month raised just a bit, 40 million pounds, mainly reflecting higher cow slaughter. And then for 2024, beef production, we raised by about 110 million pounds. Basically, larger supplies, more cattle have been brought into feedlots late in 2023, which will be available for beef production later later into 2024. The pork production increased for both 2023 and 2024, largely reflects the data that we got from the September 28th hogs and pigs report. For 2023, that's reflecting the larger first half pig crop that report had implied. And then for 2024, that mainly reflects the fairly significant jump in pigs per litter, suggesting, again, higher supplies carrying into 2024. Broiler production down in both years, 2023 and 2024. Basically, that industry is correcting. It's kind of in a correction mode, pulling back a bit on supplies. We're seeing that in the hatchery data and elsewhere. So not a big surprise there. Turkey production also down both years, and that's also just been reflected in lower weights and in the hatchery data as well. Prices, steer prices for 2023 dropped to $1.18 per hundredweight this month, just basically reflecting recent observed prices. For next year, that reduction is really all in the first half of the year, with supplies expected to tighten up in the second half of the year. Hog prices down as well, reflecting that increase in supplies, larger pig crops for both 2023 and 2024. Broiler prices, we adjusted up a little bit this month for both years, 2023 and 2024, reflecting the tighter supplies, as you can see our supply adjustments. And turkey prices have just been soft and just poor demand, despite the lower production that we're forecasting. Meat trade, beef trade down, kind of, for 2023, we're really looking mainly at just recent trade data. But our beef is just, not as competitive as it could be given the high prices in the US. So that's affecting the outlook for both the balance of 2023 and into 2024. Pork exports down in 2023, again, reflecting current data, just observed data, but expected to grow in 2024, reflecting those higher supplies. Not a big surprise there either. Broiler exports, strong, so strengthening in 2023, but expected to decline a bit in 2024, given the higher prices that we're forecasting. And finally, I'll just note beef imports adjusted higher for both years this month as well, mainly reflecting supplies coming in from Australia and New Zealand. And finally, I'm going to wrap things up here with dairy, U.S. milk supply and demand. Milk production 2023 down up a bit this month, reflecting higher milk per cow. Basically, cows have recovered a little bit quicker than we expected from the heat conditions high heat conditions they experienced late in the summer. So production up there. No change to 2024 milk production this month. Product supply and demand, fat basis imports, no change for 2023, but for 2024, that's 100 million pounds of butter. And you'll see soon that butter demand and prices have been very strong in the US, and that's driving some of this import demand. Exports, fat basis exports down for 2023. That's also reflecting lower butter exports and for both years, 2023 and 2024. And in terms of skim solids basis, 2023 up a bit. That's mainly milk proteins. Exports down. That's non-fat dry milk and whey. And then in 2024, adjusted our import forecast lower based on cheese and milk prices, and exports for skim solids basis is also whey. So dairy product prices, 2023 cheese prices adjusted lower this month, just mainly reflecting large supplies and steady demand, stable demand. That is for both current calendar year and into 2024. But butter is where the interesting story has been. Big increase in our butter price forecast this month, 12 cents per pound, and expected to also carry forward into 2024. And this is just really observed strength in prices, strong demand, a lot of which would really just came up within the past few weeks. So a lot of price strength in the butter market right now. Non-fat dry milk also see some demand strength there, pulling those prices higher as well. So then in terms of dairy prices, class 3 prices down this month for both years based on those lower cheese prices. Class 4 prices higher, driven by the strength in the butter market primarily, and all milk prices for both the current calendar year and next calendar year we raised, reflecting those higher class prices. So we're looking at all milk prices of $20.70 for 2023, and down just a bit, 2024, $20.55 per hundredweight. And that is all I have with regard to the WASDE. So thank you for your attention. I hope you all enjoyed it. Might have learned a little bit about what's driving these changes. And thank you also to folks who tuned in online, and we will see you back here next month.